Right. Today I want to talk about Buddhism, especially as it relates to origins. Um, in world religions, we can talk more about some of the different sects and practices of the Buddhist tradition. But let me start by saying Buddhism is to Hinduism as Christianity is to Judaism. And what I mean by that is, just as Christians see themselves as a continuation of the monistic Abrahamic tradition, and they see Jesus as a fulfillment of the promises found in what Christians call the Old Testament. The Jews call it the Tanakh, the first 5 books being the Torah. But Christians see Jesus as being God incarnate and fulfilling promises made all the way back in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. And similarly, in Hinduism, Siddhartha Gautama, who lived in roughly the 6th century in northern India, perhaps present-day Nepal, and we still have the kingdom, we have archaeological finds, so this is a historical figure. This isn't just mythology, but the Buddha was born into a royal family. He wasn't the Buddha, of course, at the time, Siddhartha Gautama. And his father, on his birth, it reminds me a lot of the birth of Jesus. There were signs, there were omens, there were portents, there were visions, and a holy man came, which reminds me of Simeon in the Bible, who asked to see the Christ child before he died. And at the temple, when Jesus his parents had brought him for this circumcision, Simeon got to hold him and was so excited but also sad because he realized this was going to be the savior of the world. Similarly, when Siddhartha Gautama was born, a holy man, a sage seer, came and he held the little child, and he told Siddhartha's father, who was a king, he said, "Your son will either become a great warlord that will combine the kingdoms of the subcontinent, or he will become the savior of the world, a spiritual man, someone to help take away pain and suffering." And his father, being a king, said, "Well, that's great. We'll take option 1. Thank you very much." And the holy man said, "You can pick what you want, but fate is not always what we desire or choose." And so the holy man left. Shortly thereafter, Siddhartha's mother died, and his father raised him in such a way as to not to have any religious sensibilities. So he raised him in statecraft. He sated him with pleasure. He gave him his every desire. He had summer palaces, winter palaces. He had a beautiful wife, and he had just had a child. But as Siddhartha got older and had lived this charmed life, kept from all pain and suffering or anything that would cause him to have a questioning or inquisitive mind on why am I here? What is the meaning or purpose of life? What happens to us when we die? Why do the innocent suffer? Siddhartha wasn't struggling with any of those typical human questions or dilemmas. But as he got older and had his first child, he realized, I don't even know my own kingdom. How am I supposed to rule? And so he told his father, I need to see my people. And so his father, being very clever, put kind of like a facade down the main street of the capital city. And he gave the residents new clothes. He put on a feast so they'd all have greasy lips and be happy and satisfied. And they threw this huge coming out parade for Siddhartha, who, riding on an elephant, rode through the town to cheers and accolades and all the happy, smiling people. Yeah, it wasn't as nice as the palace, but the people were fed, they were clothed, they seemed happy. Siddhartha was so taken by the joys of his newfound kingdom he got to explore for the first time that he snuck it out again later with his servant. But this time the facade was gone, the party was over, the fancy clothes had been put away, and people had returned to their life of drudgery. And if you can imagine what life must have been like in 6th century India. What Siddhartha saw this time was very different than the beautiful colors and the sounds of the music and the smells of the incense, but now he could see and smell and hear the real sounds of the everyday city. And the first thing he noticed was some old people Siddhartha had never even seen old people before because his father didn't want him to realize people got old and died. This young man had never been exposed to old age, let alone death. And so he asked his servant, "What's wrong with these people? Why are they all wrinkly and hunched over?" And his servant said, "They're old, Siddhartha. Old age comes to all of us." And Siddhartha says, "Even to a prince?" And his servant said, "Yes, Siddhartha, even to a prince." The next person they met was someone that was sick, and they were screaming in agony and pain. They had some terrible disease. And Siddhartha had never been around someone who was sick or had a chronic illness or disease. And he asked his servant, "What's wrong with that person?" And the servant said, "They're sick, Siddhartha. No one passes from birth to death without being sick at least once in their life." And Siddhartha said, "Even princes?" And his servant said, "Yes, Siddhartha, even princes." And so Siddhartha said, "Show me this death." And so his servant took him down to the river where they took the dead bodies. And his servant said, "Just as wood, when it is dry, is cast into the flames to be burned, so too, when humans die, we dry out, we become stiff, and we too must be burned in the fire." And Siddhartha said, "Even princes?" And his servant said, "Yes, Siddhartha, even princes." And then the fourth thing Siddhartha, or person Siddhartha, saw on that day, after seeing old age, sickness, and death, was he saw a sadhu. And a sadhu is a holy man, ascetic, a Hindu ascetic. And if you remember, ascetics are people who believe that by depriving the physical body, you can release the soul or spirit. So these people practice extreme forms of fasting, feats of discomfort. They might sit for years in front of a boulder, basically becoming like a rock, or next to a creosote bush in the desert, just swaying with the bush and the breeze, becoming one with the breeze, living off of water droplets, water raindrops, or bird droppings. And it was a hard life, but the idea was, if this physical vehicle we're in is illusion, or if it's transitory, if it's passing, let's minimize our care and focus on this body. Let's let the sex, drugs, and rock and roll go, and let's focus on these eternal things of the mind, of the spirit, these things that transcend the body. And so he meditated for years with these sadhus, but then one day during his meditation, he heard a teacher, it was a music teacher, teaching his student how to play. And it was a sitar, which it's like a guitar, but it has more strings, more range. And the teacher told the student, he said, "If you tighten the string too tight, it will snap. But if it's too loose, you cannot play." And Siddhartha Gautama had like an aha moment at that point, and he realized you have to avoid extremes. You can reckon either ditch. The ditch of extreme austerity and asceticism, or the ditch of libertinism and indulging the senses. And so what he developed is what's called the Buddha's middle way. And the middle way was to avoid these extremes. That was the path to enlightenment. It reminds me a lot of Aristotle's virtue ethics, this idea of we need to let go of the excess and the deficiencies in our life. And Siddhartha vowed that he was going to meditate, to fast and meditate, and practice this ascetic lifestyle until he found the answer to human suffering. And this culminated under the Bodhi tree, where he had a 40-day fast. Sound familiar? Okay. Remember, this is about 600 years before Christ, or Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, but the parallels are quite stunning. So here's Siddhartha fasting for 40 days and nights under the Bodhi tree. He's rejected this idea of extreme asceticism, or let go and let Godism, and he's trying to find this balanced middle way. And what he's realizing is, just like we talked about the Hindu deconstruction of the self, that thousand-petaled lotus of the heart, where you're deconstructing your roles and your relationships, that Siddhartha isn't just a son, right? He isn't just a teacher. He isn't just a Hindu. He isn't just from the subcontinent of India. But there's an essential core self beyond all of that. And in this deconstruction process, as he comes to the last petal, this last challenge, the whole time he's going through this process, the Lord of Darkness, of illusion, Mara, is trying to tempt him. And just like the temptations of Jesus, Mara has, in this sense, the vices are personified as like the daughters of Mara, where you have lust, jealousy, pride, greed, gluttony, all these different vices or appeals to the flesh to bind us to this world of illusion. And one by one, Siddhartha rejected them. He could not be enticed, either through pleasure or deterred by fear. He was going to follow this path to the end. And that last petal, that last deconstruction he had to undo was his own ego. Because your ego is the ultimate trap to hold you into this world of illusion. And so the Buddhist practice coming out of this is called annihilation of the self, where you literally have to put to death your own ego. You have to get rid of it if you want to have any hope of this universal cosmic mind. And so with that last petal, where Siddhartha rejects his own ego, and in the movie The Little Buddha, it's a great line. He said, "O Lord of my own ego, I see and declare you as pure illusion." And as he does this, all the illusion fades away and he becomes one with the universal mind. But in order to be one with the universal mind, you have to lose your individual egocentric mind. So that is the Buddha's death of self. And in dying to self, you can be connected to everything. And that is, reaching that place of nothingness is another way of talking about reaching a place of everythingness. Okay, any questions or comments on that? And like I said, if you if you want to watch that movie, The Little Buddha, part of what I like about that movie is these Tibetan Buddhist monks give the Seattle family, who they think may have given birth to their deceased Lama, this high-ranking Buddhist religious figure, and they give this little boy a book called Little Buddha. And in it, it's a storybook for children, just like we have in Christianity talking about Jesus, but this is like the birth and life of the Buddha. And as the mother reads the boy the story, they flash back to ancient India. Now, it's a more embellished, maybe mythological version, but it still captures the essential core of it. Any questions or comments? So yeah, recommend would be that movie, The Little Buddha. I think you'd get a lot out of it. Okay, well, while I'm waiting to see if there's any questions or comments, the slide I have pulled up for you, and I guess I can show my other audience. I'm still trying to learn how to record from two cameras at once.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So how this was written 600 years before the Bible, right? Is that what you said?
I'm saying the historical figure Siddhartha Gautama lived about 500 to 600 years before the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth.
Is that written down, or was this told through just verbal?
Yes, and like I said, there's archaeological evidence for the city he came from, the kingdom he was associated with. Like we have biblical archaeology, this would be kind of like Vedic archaeology. And once again, to be clear, the Buddha wasn't claiming to be divine. He wasn't claiming to be the son of God. He wasn't claiming to be an avatar, even though in some Hindu sects later, Siddhartha Gautama actually is seen as the 9th avatar of Vishnu, which is fascinating to me because he never claimed that. Siddhartha just said, I'm trying to find an end to suffering. He wasn't promising salvation. He wasn't promising anything else. He just said, if you want to stop suffering, I think I found the key. Excuse me. Any other questions, comments? Excuse me, that dry cough. Let's hope it ain't that corona cough. Excuse me. Okay, so Siddhartha isn't claiming to be God. He isn't claiming to save you. He isn't saying you're going to go to heaven. He's simply saying, if you want to stop suffering, I can give you some pointers. And this is what he came up with, and it's called the Four Noble Truths. I'm sorry I don't have a... I still can't figure out that whiteboard function, or I would be using it. It seems to lag out my computer, but I need to get a little whiteboard for my room since I seem to love drawing so much while I'm teaching. Anyways, the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is to live is to suffer. And I think I gotta give Siddhartha this one. If you are born into this world, there is going to be some sort of pain and suffering. There's going to be a trial simply by virtue of being alive under the sun. Once again, going back to Ecclesiastes and Solomon went so far to say the suffering is so great under the sun that better are those that were never born than that those that are alive, because they didn't have to deal with it. The cause of this suffering, Siddhartha discovered, is desire. So that's the second noble truth. The first, to live is to suffer. The second is suffering comes from desiring. And this is quite profound. And maybe some of you have already experienced or come to this truth on your own. Perhaps you have a family member or a significant other or relationship where that person has disappointed you and hurt you over and over and over again. And you're exasperated, you're at your wit's end. And the only way you can find any sort of semblance or peace with that family member or significant other that's acting out or causing you pain and suffering is to simply let them go and to not have expectations on their behavior or actions anymore. And you might say, well, how can I do that with someone I love? Well, that's the thing. If you love them, with love, there's going to be pain and suffering, because love has hope, right? Love has expectations. Love has things that they want from the other, from the beloved. But if your beloved does not come through and give you those things or the way that you want to have them, there's going to be a sense of hurt or pain. And so what Siddhartha is recommending is, if you don't want to suffer, you have to let go of the desire. If you no longer have expectations of being loved in return, then that other person or family member can't hurt you. If you have no expectations that they're going to be kind and decent and polite and civil, then when they act in inappropriate and harmful ways, you're expecting it. You're prepared for it. You don't have your guard down because you're not expecting love, and here you're getting all this hate. So desire causes pain and suffering. When we have expectations, even something like this coronavirus, our typical expectations is that we can go out and do our jobs and live our lives and not have to be hunkered down trying to let this thing pass or to slowly move through our culture or society. But what Siddhartha would say, if you have no expectations or hope or desire to go outside, then lockdown is no punishment. It's no infringement upon your freedoms, because you're not being limited from things you desire, because you're not desiring things. Hence, if you want to stop suffering, this is the third noble truth. No suffer comes from no desire. But as you can well imagine, that has its own paradoxical difficulties. Because if you desire to stop desiring, and then you end up desiring again, you're going to be hurt because now Now, what you didn't want to happen is happening. And because you had a want that isn't being fulfilled, now there is suffering. Does that make sense? So, the tricky part for the Buddhist is how do you achieve desiring or a desireless state without desiring a desireless state? Okay. The people did raise that objection to the Buddha, and his response was, "You are clever, but cleverness will not bring you happiness. You can be all clever about the paradox of desiring not to desire, but as long as you continue to desire, you're going to suffer." Just quickly before I go, well, let me do the fourth noble truth. No, I better do it now or I'm going to forget. Before I do the fourth noble truth, when people ask the Buddha about, since this has to do with creation and origins, when they ask the Buddha, where did we come from and what happens to us when we die, his response was, you can't even live in the here and now, but you want to be all worried about where you came from and where you're going? Be here now. Be present, because this is the only time there is. So I know that's not very helpful. The closest we could probably extract from a Buddhist idea of a creation account, at least if we separate it from its Hindu origins, would be this idea that creation came from desire. Fascinating, right? So somewhere in the one, in this unified whole, in this cosmic consciousness, arose desire. And then out of that desire arose the physical material world and sentient beings. So the desire brings things into existence, and ceasing to desire brings things out of existence. But remember, into existence and out of existence are all still part of the same thing for the Buddhist. It's just two different ways of talking about the same thing, when everything and nothing become one. All right. The fourth noble truth is called the Eightfold Path, and that's the slide I have up for you. And it's similar to the Ten Commandments, like a Buddhist-style Ten Commandments. So if you want to stop desiring, these are the things you need to do. You need to have a right view. You need to have right intention. This is like a deontological ethic in the West. It's not just about outcomes. It's not just about consequences, but you have to have a right-mindedness. Right speech. Let no unwholesome thing proceed from your mouth, right? You want to cut gossip, slander, violent words. You want your words to be seasoned with salt, uplifting. Right action. So it's not just about having right intention, because the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? But you also need to have right action to go with the right intentions. Right livelihood. Basically what this means is you use your strength, you use your efforts in a good and wholesome way, where you're not going to be harming other sentient beings, other parts of the one. Right effort. You're putting your energies and things into the right purposes and causes in the right way, right concentration, and then right mindfulness. And it really does come down to that. Like in Hinduism, Buddhism, even though there is a lot of orthopraxy, it really comes down to right understanding. Because once you understand your true nature, your true self, which is no self, there is no you, you are just part of the one, of the cosmos, then everything is okay. Everything is as it should be. And you can have this kind of Buddha bliss consciousness. You see that the things and the inequities of this world are pure illusion. They rise and fall, but it does not change the eternal essence in the end. Any questions, comments? That was like super brief intro to Buddhism, but it was important for me that you understand a little bit about the history of Siddhartha Gautama, and then to get a little bit about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. In the next lecture, I'm going to give you some of the different flavors of Buddhism, because Buddhism, like Christianity, is very synchronistic. And what I mean by that is, remember we talked about syncretism is where you take two divergent frequencies or objects or ideologies and you harmonize them or you bring them together. And Buddhism, like Christianity, it was very missional. And as it traveled throughout the ancient world, it would synthesize or sync itself with the traditions and cultures of the people. So the Buddhism of India is going to look very different from the Buddhism of China, of Korea, of Japan, of Southeast Asia, let alone California. In fact, California has some of the most vibrant Buddhist communities in the world. And I think part of that is because it's not just something you were born into, right? You're not just you're not an indoctrinated Buddhist, but you probably converted from another religion or non-religion into Buddhism. So it's fresh, it's new, it's passionate, it's yours. And we have a lot of those communities here in California. In fact, let me bring up my screen share again. A website you might want to check out is called buddhanet.net. And it's worth exploring. You will be stunned how many Buddhist temples, monasteries, places are here just in San Diego County. So as you can see, it has a worldwide Buddhist directory on there. There's a Buddhist library. There's Buddhist apologetics. So you can see a Buddhist take on theism or on atheism or on different Buddhist sects. And we'll also explain to you some of the differences. So what I'm going to do next class is I'm going to talk about kind of like how after Siddhartha Gautama, the teachings of the Buddha were transmitted to his disciples, and then they, like missionaries, spread throughout the subcontinent of India, and then Buddhist missionaries went to China, and from China to Korea, Japan, and then eventually to America and Europe. And so we will talk about that, and you'll see kind of like the distinctions we have in Christianity. You have some that are more traditional, where you're trying to kind of imitate the life of the Buddha in the hopes of, if we dress like him, eat like him, meditate like him, think like him, perhaps we can become enlightened like him. Where others are saying, no, it's not about imitating the Buddha, it's realizing that we all have the Buddha nature. We all have the Buddha mind. And it's not about striving or doing things or cutting your hair a certain way or eating certain foods or wearing certain clothes or doing certain pilgrimages or prayers. It's simply realizing you're already there. There's nothing you have to accomplish. There's nothing you have to achieve. You simply are. You simply be. Be here now. And I think you'll find it fascinating, and we'll talk about, it will be a nice segue into Taoism, and I'll give you a little Confucianism as well as we travel to China next class, and we talk about some of the different flavors of Buddhism, and then we'll segue into Taoism. All right, well, that will be good for this intro.